Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Tia Mitchell, and it's the start of a ridiculously busy week. Tia, tomorrow's primary day. We're finally here, May 19th.
Yes, I can't wait to see how things shake out, especially because so much of our polling tells us that voters waited until the last minute to make their decision. So there could be a lot of surprises.
Yeah, 1/3 of likely Democratic and Republican voters in the governor's races are undecided, and more than half of the likely Republican voters in the Senate race are undecided. So there's a lot up in the air. I know we're going to be diving deep all week into what happened and what it means. But today is the listener mailbag. And as we do every Monday, we answer your questions that you called or texted to 770-810-5297. or emailed to politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. Producer Shani B., I know you've gotten a lot of questions about this primary.
We did get a lot of questions. So we'll start off with Ted in Atlanta, who has a question about his ballot.
So I have my sample ballot in front of me, and there are 19 judicial races listed on my sample ballot. And my question is just the verbiage that they use to kind of describe each race. So I'm just going to read one off to you and then ask my question. So for Justice Supreme Court of Georgia, then in parentheses it says to succeed Charlie Bethel. And then in parentheses again it says vote for one. And then below that it says, Charlie Bethel incumbent. And then it had Miracle Rankin underneath and a place for a write-in. So that's my question. It lists him to succeed him, but it also lists him as an incumbent. So that implies to me that every one of these 19 judges is their 6-year term, all ending this year, and that's why they need to be succeeded by somebody, but they're also listed as an incumbent. So if you could shed any light on that, it'd be great.
Yeah, great question. And Tia, this reminds us of how much more attention these judicial races in Georgia are getting, especially because Democrats are going all in for the challengers to Justices Bethel and Warren. And of course, they're fighting back with their own coalitions. You can hear interviews with all 4 of those candidates if you go back into the Politically Georgia archives. But the Supreme Court races, those are 6-year terms, and there are 3 judges up, but only 2 of them are facing these heated challengers. But yeah, they cycle 6 years, and there are all those other judges on your ballots. That depends on your county, but there's a number of county and Superior Court, State Court, all those judges up as well.
Yeah, I want to, number one, let's applaud Ted for doing the work. 19 judges. He's got some congressional races and the Senate race and all the other races. And it's clear that Ted is doing what he's supposed to do. He's getting his sample ballot and he's working through what's listed just to decide who he wants to vote for. So I know it's not easy sometimes. And let's be honest, for the most part, a lot of people are going to say, I haven't heard anything about these judges. I'm okay with being the incumbent, and that's okay. But he was right. Ted was right. The ballot basically says this is Charlie Bethel's seat. And do you want to keep him? Do you want to vote for someone else like Miracle Rankin? Or do you want to write in a name of your own? So it kind of looks weird, but that's basically what that means is, do you want to retain the incumbent or replace it with a challenger? And I do want to remind people, because I think you might not feel strongly about a race or not feel like you have all the information. It is okay to leave certain races blank if you like. I'm not encouraging that, but I think what people will tell you is they would rather you vote in the races that you feel comfortable in than not voting at all. So don't let an obscure race or something that you really, really feel like you can't make a decision discourage you from voting altogether. You can skip some, but you could also be like Ted, get your sample ballot, do a little research, and try to make as many choices as you feel comfortable making on your ballot.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I have a lot of friends who go into the ballot box and they only vote in the races they know. And if they don't know who the watershed commissioner should be or who the probate judge should be, they just skip it, even if it's an incumbent who's likely to win. And then one more part of Ted's question. There are 9 Supreme Court justices for Georgia Supreme Court. That is a 6-year term. For other judicial posts, it's a 4-year term. So they're all kind of staggered. And that means that there's going to be a constant stream of these judicial races on everyone's ballot every couple of years. And May 19th is the final vote for those races. There is no November vote for those races, so it means lesser turnout, and that tends to help incumbents, but we'll see what happens this year with all the attention on the Supreme Court justice, millions of dollars spent from both sides, but far more looks like from the Democratic side on these challengers to the Supreme Court justice incumbents. Shani B, what else we got?
Lately on the Monday mailbag, we've had a great streak of everybody remembering to give us a name or where they're calling from, but somebody violated the rule this week. So if you don't leave a name, I give you a name. So we heard from dissatisfied David in Dawsonville, who has this question about something that he's hearing in one of Rick Jackson's ads.
Why is Mr. Rick Jackson allowed to threaten life in his political ads? What is the difference between deported and departed? Do we need cryptic 86 numbers? No. This is an overt threat against life, and he's doing it over and over again. You and I are not allowed to say who should be departed and who shouldn't. That would include Mr. Rick Jackson. That's my question.
Great question. This is about Rick Jackson. God, I mean, he has feels like hundreds of ads. He has spent $83 million on his campaign and counting. So that is a staggering amount of money. But this is the commercial that really got a lot of attention. And I'll just kind of read you the script. I don't care if you're a Muslim or a Mongolian. You don't have the right to force your culture on our country, Jackson says in the ad. Too often, criminal illegals commit sick, violent crimes, victimize our children, and get away with murder. So here's my guarantee to them. Do that when I'm governor, and you'll end up deported or departed. Any questions? So, yeah, I mean, Tia, this is the sort of tough talk that has gotten Republican candidates a lot of attention in the past, and also a lot of backlash that could come haunt them in a general election when you're going for more independent voters.
Yeah, it seems a lot of Republicans turn to immigration when they feel like it's an issue they can get their base excited about. Like, yeah, kick all the illegals out. And if you can't kick them out, then do what you have to do, because we don't care. We don't treat them as equal. We don't think they should have the same rights as U.S. citizens. You hear that rhetoric from the right. This is clearly an ad speaking to those people on the hard right who want their elected officials to take a hard line against illegal immigration. I think Rick Jackson, because he came on the scene relatively unknown, but was running as kind of the true, real conservative in the race. So and quite frankly, some of his campaign rhetoric contrasts a little bit with his business reputation. He ran a successful healthcare business that had DEI programs and things like that. It's complicated, right? Because he's a businessman. Again, trying to signal to hard right voters that, I'm with you on the issues that you care about. I do think these are going to be for play in a general election. Rick Jackson's trying to get to a general election. He's got in a primary first. He knew he had to take out Burt Jones to do it, which I think his strategy was running to the right of Burt Jones. So we'll see if it pays off.
Yeah, and his campaign would tell you he's not just talking about people in the country illegally. He's talking about people in the country illegally who are committing violent crimes. So I'm just extrapolating who might potentially face the death penalty anyway. That is not an excuse for folks who are outraged and upset by that sort of rhetoric. It just that the reasoning behind that ad, of course, is it all goes back to the Kemp shotgun ad and the, you name it, right? There's been a series of these sort of provocative ads that gets people like us talking about it and upsets voters in some corners, but also riles them up in others, and could be something that motivates people to go to the polls for Rick Jackson just as much as it motivates them to vote against Rick Jackson. Shani B, what else we got?
Well, you know what? And for David, too, he made the reference 86. And I think what got his goat was the DOJ going after James Comey for the 8647 tweet. And
the double standard.
The double standard. And I think that really got to him. And it's an interesting point.
Yeah.
So let's talk about TADS with Solomon.
I recently was talking to somebody, and they were telling me more about the tax allocation districts. I wonder why the AJC hasn't reported on anything around the renewing of the TADs or any information on anything regarding the request from multiple companies to get new tax allocations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm assuming you're talking about the city of Atlanta, these TADs that have been a giant source of controversy, really, not just this or that last year, but for years, right? These are controversial TAD programs that basically help raise taxes in these special districts that help development and encourage, let's say there's TADs around the Beltline, right? And so they help spark a lot of development around Beltline projects, but are also controversial because they take tax money that could be used for local government, for schools, for parks, for libraries, you name it. And we have been covering a lot of it. Our City Hall team has been covering specifically a lot about the $5 billion TAD project that is really the linchpin of Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens' second term. Has come up less in the state politics that we cover even more closely on this podcast, but certainly the AJC and our team over at the City Hall Bureau has been diving into the implications of this because, Tia, for someone like Mayor Dickens, who is riding in, he overwhelmingly won a second term, and he now has to decide what he wants his legacy to be. This is a big part of it.
I'll swallow my rant to get to your point, Greg.
No, you can give it.
My tongue. But to your point, Mayor Dickens has used these tax allocation districts. They are part of his agenda. He and proponents of the tax allocation districts say they're an important economic development tool that allows, like you mentioned, places like the Beltline, places like the West Side, the Upper West Side. They say, if you like some of the amenities and cool things you're seeing there, well, look to the tax allocation districts as how we were able to make it happen. But I agree that they are controversial. And back to my rant.
Mm-hmm.
It is not true that the AJC isn't covering it, and let alone the wider media cohort, if you will, in Metro Atlanta. It's got quite a bit of media coverage, and that's probably one of the reasons why you're even asking about it, Solomon.
I've heard that. I don't call it a rant. I just call it a gentle reminder to our listeners, and I've heard that before, and I love it. I'm happy to hear it again. Shani B, what else we got?
Here's an email from Haley in Toccoa. My question is about Brad Raffensperger and Chris Carr to a lesser extent. With renewed scrutiny over the 2020 election, why isn't the Secretary of State using his actions during and after the original questioning of the election and its validity to create a lane for himself in the gubernatorial race? Wouldn't he want to highlight his role in upholding the 2020 election in order to differentiate himself from Jones and Jackson, appeal to undecided voters, and make himself more electable in November?
Great question, Haley. And it's one, I was with Brad Raffensperger just a couple days ago for a big chunk of the day. And I've been on the campaign trail with him for dozens of stops over the last, a year and a half. And he rarely talks like up front and center about 2020. He'd rather talk about public safety. He'd rather talk about affordability. He'd rather talk about, what's next, the future, than talk about what made him famous, not just to millions of Georgians, but just to millions of Americans, of course, which that 2021 phone call where he told Donald Trump, no, I won't overturn the election results in Georgia. And there's reasons for that. And one is pretty obvious. One is that this is a Republican primary dominated by folks who think very highly of the president, and many of them, might have backed those efforts to overturn the 2020 election. So putting that front and center might only hobble his campaign more. He's already in third place, distantly trailing Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and billionaire Rick Jackson. So that might be part of the calculus. But the other part of it too is that elections are about the future. So you see other candidates running who are talking some about what they've done, but a lot about what they want to do.
Yeah, I agree, Greg, everything you just said. Particularly, it kind of goes back to what we were saying about even Rick Jackson in the primary, speaking to those hardliner, deeply conservative voters who become the base of the Republican Party in a primary. That being said, should Brad Raffensperger win the primary, I think Democrats do say his message would be tough to beat in a general election because there could be crossover voters who like and trust Brad Raffensperger because they do feel like he has an independent spirit and they applaud what he did in 2020, and they might want to support him even if they don't normally vote for Republicans. But that's in a general election. Haley's message is right, but more for a general election.
Perfectly said. And you're right. If I was one of his advisors, you'd probably be saying, hey, you should lead with 2020 in a general election campaign. But certainly now he is not doing that whatsoever. Well, Shani B, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to tackle some more questions on Voting Rights Act fallout, appealing to moderate voters, and the national debt. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to our Monday mailbag edition of Politically Georgia. Greg Bluestein here with Tia Mitchell, answering your questions. And Shani B has our next one on this primary week.
All right, this one's a text from Melissa in Cartersville. Are those guys behind the First Liberty loan scandal ever going to get punished?
Good question, Melissa. I was in federal court just a few days ago in Noonan, which is the sort of the center, the headquarters of this First Liberty building and loan scandal. Which we can now accurately call a scandal because there's been a guilty plea. For a long time, Brant Frost IV, the founder of this firm, was saying that he was not guilty. He pleaded not guilty a few weeks ago. Well, he has now pleaded guilty to one count of federal wire fraud charges, carries a maximum sentence of up to 20 years. Federal prosecutors are recommending a 14-year sentence. That is up to the federal judge. But yeah, the reason we're even talking about a Ponzi scheme on a political show is this because this group, First Liberty, was so tightly woven into the Republican fabric in Georgia. This is a group that spent more than $1 million on campaign contributions. Brant Frost IV and his son Brant Frost V were very involved in the GRA, the Georgia Republican Assembly, which is this far-right ultra-conservative group that helped shape grassroots politics in Georgia and has become an issue in campaigns in Georgia. You know, it came up in the lieutenant governor's debate even. So this is an issue that has far-reaching consequences in Georgia, and this might not be the last prosecution.
Yeah. If I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, there is some investigation going on under the Gold Dome with the General Assembly, right? Looking into beyond just the court case, just looking into what happened and lessons learned or more accountability.
Yes. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who of course is a Republican candidate for governor, we just talked about, he has led the charge into state sanctions. His office oversees these securities, so he's led the charge into state sanctions. There's been fines. There's been bans on future activity in the securities industry here in Georgia. So the fallout is only continuing. I talked to U.S. Attorney Theodore Hertzberg, who told me that the investigation remains very much open. And there's a potential for other folks who could get charged, and we'll have to wait to see. But that sort of answers your question there, Melissa. This case has folks have gotten punished, and we'll see exactly to the extent of that at the August sentencing hearing. Shani B, what else we got?
All right, next is Melanie in Atlanta, who called after hearing GSU professor Eric Siegel on our Voting Rights Act fallout episode last week.
My question is related to how Professor mentioned that it will never happen in our lifetime that we see partisan redistricting get banned. Why is that the case? Why is this not more of a priority for our federal lawmakers? And why isn't there a bigger push from grassroots activists and different advocacy groups to make this a priority and get fairer districts drawn?
Tia?
Yeah, I'll start. I think the biggest barrier right now is the filibuster in the Senate. So you might remember that after January 6th and all the efforts to overturn the 2020 election, Democrats who actually had the majority and they controlled the White House. They tried to pass what later became known as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It did a lot of things, but one of the things it would have done was try to shore up the Voting Rights Act and make it clear that you can't have, hyper-partisan redistricting. You can't do the type of redistricting that affects racial minorities. A lot of the things that the Supreme Court has, watered down. And again, Democrats had majorities in the House and the Senate, but they didn't have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And there's a lot of reluctance to get rid of the filibuster. And Democrats said, we don't want to get rid of the filibuster because when Republicans get in control, we don't want them to pass stuff. And Republicans are in control and they don't want to get rid of the filibuster. So, could this be an incentive if Democrats get back in power and get the White House to have a conversation about the filibuster and how that has got in the way of comprehensive voting rights reforms? Maybe, but right now it's not even a conversation because Democrats are not even in power to put this type of legislation forward.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Tia. I just remember after Senator Warnock won, it became one of his legislative priorities, which was, I think, his top priority. He gave that big speech in the Senate rotunda. He just made it the centerpiece of his legislative agenda to pass some sort of voting rights expansion that enshrines it in federal law that potentially, depending on how it would have gone through, could have protected some of these districts. It certainly is right now a huge priority for grassroots activists on both sides of the aisle. Democrats are railing against the Supreme Court ruling and the aftermath, which will inevitably lead to an overhaul of Georgia's congressional districts for the 2028 map, and taking at least one seat away from Democrats. That Sanford Bishop seat, I think, is the juiciest target, but maybe 2, potentially even 3. Although you get into some real dicey territory if you try to go that far for Democrats. And for Republicans, it's also animated their grassroots base because they're seeing states like Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina talk about revamping their maps for this upcoming session. We've seen some of those efforts be delayed. Others are going through. There's a lot going on out there. But certainly Kemp is feeling the pressure from MAGA world right now to go even further and to redraw the maps in time for this midterm election, something that he has unequivocally ruled out as too late in the process. The Supreme Court ruling came down in the middle of early voting. Hundreds of thousands have already voted. So he's saying that he wants to redraw the maps in 2026, but for 2028. I know it's confusing, but that's his sort of reasoning for that. Jenny B, what else we got?
Next is Daryl in Warner Robins, who called in with this thought on President Trump's spending.
With all the billions being spent in Washington and on gold statues and etc., what is the national debt? That's all.
Great question, Tia. I want to read this lead from the New York Times from May 7th. The U.S. government learned last week that it may have reached an unfortunate milestone. The size of its debt surpassed the nation's total economic output. And that's how big the national debt is right now. And it used to be, and by the way, about $31.26 trillion in March. So it's probably grown a little bit more since then, but we're topping $31 trillion right now. And Tia, it wasn't that long ago where we'd see Republican candidates in Georgia like David Perdue put lowering the debt, tackling the debt as their top legislative priority. And now we hardly hear about it from federal candidates.
Yeah, quite frankly, part of it is because Republicans used to be the ones that talked the most about wanting to reduce the national debt, rein in spending. And they've been passing these reconciliation bills, the One Big Beautiful Act in particular, that increased the national debt. They've been extending tax cuts that have drastically increased the national debt. So it used to be they would blame it on Democrats. Of course, during the pandemic, there were a lot of deficit spending because we were trying to keep people at home. The economy was really bad. And of course, people were out of work and all of that. But now we're post-pandemic. Republicans are in charge and they're still making decisions that increase the national debt. It's quite frankly another source of tension within the Republican Party in Congress, where you have some more hardliner budget hawks have criticized some of the spending. One of the reasons why we've had, these continuing resolutions instead of full appropriation bills. But yeah, it's something that members of Congress like to say, I'm going to balance our budget. But when it comes down to their priorities, they have chosen to keep spending.
Yeah. Tia, we've got time for one more question, and this is going to come from me, which is, what's the biggest question you have hanging over this week's primaries? What's like the biggest race, the biggest question you want answered on Tuesday?
Of course, I've been paying a lot of attention to the Senate race to see who is going to challenge Jon Ossoff in November. I think, of course, it's likely it's going to be a runoff. It's likely it'll be Mike Collins and either Buddy Carter or Derek Dooley. I'm starting to think it might be Collins and Carter, but we'll see because there's still a lot of undecided voters. And I have not covered it much, but maybe that's why I'm intrigued by the lieutenant governor's race. The lieutenant governor is so powerful in Georgia, unlike other states where it's just, second in command to the governor, but with no real built-in duties. Whereas in Georgia, the lieutenant governor isn't just a figurehead leader of the Senate. He actually controls the Senate agenda, which makes him extremely powerful. And you've got all these sitting legislators running for the lieutenant governor job. And so I find that the Republican primary for lieutenant governor so interesting.
Yeah, we think 30% undecided in the governor's races is high. We'll look to the number 2 spot, 70% of undecideds in those races. So a lot of folks are going to go in, and maybe some of them will skip it because they just don't know. Maybe some will vote for, the name they might recognize the most. But we encourage everyone to go to the AJC voter guide to dive in, because there you can see all the policies, all the platforms, our past coverage of all the candidates in all these major races up and down Georgia's ballot. My biggest question, I'm kind of looking at it sort of more, we have these two different worlds. The Democratic primary electorate, the Republican primary electorate, so vastly divided over so many issues, and then united over some issues like AI regulations and where they want the economy going. I'm interested in that consensus, and I'm interested in where some of those more independent swingy voters end up going if they vote in the Republican primary, if they vote in the Democratic primary, and of course, what role they play when they do cast their ballots. Okay, that's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you've got a question you'd like to ask us, a reminder, you can call or text our hotline anytime, day or night. Shani B is standing by, 770-810-5297 or politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. And please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform and share Politically Georgia with a friend. It really helps others discover our show. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.